Our next speaker, Toby Lodge, is the Principal Urban Planning and Design at Hassall in Australia. He's here to talk to us about transport and city making. I went to university with Toby, T Lodge, or the Lodginator. So I look forward to hearing what he's got to say.
Thank you, Henry. And he did tell me to look out for a surprise when he introduced me, so thank you. And hello, everyone. I'm pleased that I'm probably the last long speaker for the day, and hopefully I'll be able to bring some Southern Hemisphere thinking to a lot of the themes that actually Ryan's explored over the last 20-30 minutes. I wanted to base my talk in the idea of the wider shift towards sustainable infrastructure. And when I'm talking about sustainable infrastructure, it's the whole idea about unlocking city life. And I think when I go through my slides, you'll see that I'm talking about thinking at various different scales. So all the way from mega scale, and when we're talking about transport projects, we're often talking about long linear bits of infrastructure which can divide cities as much as they bring them together. And I think for me, one of the really interesting things about transport is that it's one of the things that really brings governments together. So you can actually develop ideas that can transform a city. And for me, this was a realisation I had about 10 or 15 years ago, and it really fueled my interest in transport. So hopefully what I'll take you through will start to unpack my motivation, and in particular this recurring idea for me about, are we making infrastructure decisions that benefit the city, and are the bits of infrastructure that we're investing in, are they virtuous or are they vicious? And I think hopefully we'll be able to talk about that as we move through. So there's a whole series of themes that I'm going to run through, and but underlying all of these is really about how we harness growth to create better quality cities. And I don't want to replicate some of the discussion that happened this morning, but if we do look at growth in the developed economies of the world, we know that it's a really fundamental factor that can drive change. And the role for all of us involved in the built environment is to hopefully direct that change so it's making a better city rather than a city that's lacking in opportunity. And for me, when I look at Australia and New Zealand, I think that we are experiencing significant levels of growth in each of these countries. And how does that begin to affect our cities, not only for the next 20 years, but the next 30, 40, 50, 60, and even 80 years into the future? And I speculate that, yes, most of the growth that we'll be seeing in our countries will be directed into the major cities, but I also think there's going to be a second tier of cities emerge. And these are cities which are less than 1 million people. They're cities which, there's a number of them already in New Zealand, there's a number of them already in Australia, and as these cities grow, they have increasingly more complex issues to deal with. But I think there's light at the end of the tunnel for a lot of these medium-sized cities, because if we look around the world, there's a whole range of really fantastic examples where they're actually beginning to walk to a different beat of the drum. And they're driving economies which we don't see in the traditional large cities. And they're attracting people because they have a different lifestyle offer. And this is enabling them to compete in a global economy in different ways. And how we construct our transport network is fundamental to this, because these cities have all of the lifestyle, amenity, and other attributes of the major cities, but they don't have the same hassle. They're not as congested. They're not crippled by their commitment to the car. And if we look at just some of the stats around innovation and patent generation in these medium-sized cities, if you look to the US, 8 of the 10 leading cities for patent generation per capita are actually under 800,000 people. And if you go to the UK, it's 10 out of 10. So when I'm talking about these cities, I'm thinking about how they begin to structure themselves into the future. And most importantly, when we're talking about the performance of Australian and New Zealand cities on the world stage, our cities are some of the most livable on the planet. And this is bankable currency in relation to attracting talent. The number of American accents that I've been hearing down around the Wynyard Quarter is quite phenomenal. So we're obviously attracting the right people to drive forward our economy. our economies as they're beginning to evolve. And I think we need to think about the type of transport systems that we establish that make those make our cities attractive into the future. And back in 2010, Infrastructure Australia, one of the first reports it produced was that we need to think beyond the car in relation to how we're delivering infrastructure into our cities. And for me, this was a really important turning point. And it started probably the last 10 years of thinking for me and also for my colleagues at Hassall about, well, how does transport influence the city, and how does the city in turn influence transport? And this is a cycle that goes on. And the more we thought about it, we actually began to think about it in more detail and more complexity. And we started to think about the intersection between the livability of our places, their economic performance, and also the accessibility framework. And some of the elements that I want to talk through today are about, and funnily enough, they pick up some of the themes that you've identified, Ryan, making sure that you're vision-led in relation to your investment decisions around transport, but then making sure that that flows down into community dividend, having a city-building mindset with very clear priorities and a clear narrative, because when we actually engage with politicians and the public in relation to our investment in these sort of projects, we actually need to convince them that the sort of projects that we're talking about are desirable. So when we actually start thinking about transport, we've got a whole menu of different options to choose from. Some of these options aren't on the table for every city, but I think one of the interesting things, if we think about transport over the last 10 or so years, is just how much it's changing with the evolution of rideshare apps and what have you. The way we're beginning to move towards mobility as a service, which is being enabled by the technology that we have these days. And a lot of people will say that, well, we don't need public transport anymore because we have all of this fantastic technology and rideshare and Ubers here and everything else. But the reality is that until we find a technology that removes our mode of transport from the ground plane, we still need to deal with congestion. And different people are speculating that rideshare technology and electronic cars and what have you will actually multiply the levels of congestion we have in our cities, which has a direct impact on our livability. So when we're selecting from the menu of different transport options that we have available, we also need to consider the depth of the public purse and what we can begin to direct into solving some of these wicked problems for our cities. And not every city will be able to afford its metro. And Sydney's obviously building metro at the moment. Melbourne, Brisbane's engaging in that at the moment. Perth's been talking about it for quite a bit of time. Mostly these sort of projects really only start becoming viable until a city's about 1 to 2 million people. Then other than that, you've got surface rail, light rail, busway. So we're talking about the critical infrastructure, which is public transport, trunk infrastructure that actually reduces congestion on the road network. We know also that public transport creates value, and there was a fabulous report released last year in Sydney which looked at the investment in transport and property values over a 20 or 30 year period. And all the graphs that you see here on the, your left, no, right, sorry, they actually, they may not look like much up there on screen, but what they tell you is that development or houses within 400 or 500 metres walk of transport progressively gain value to the tune of about 5% more per annum than dwellings elsewhere in the city. And for me, this was a really important outcome because that creates value not only for the people who choose to live near high-quality public transport, but also for the governments who through various passive value capture mechanisms get an ongoing income stream from it. So this was a really important study for me that began to say that public transport actually makes governments money. Now the first theme, and this is really the start of where we begin big and then begin to narrow down in scale. We need to think big, but we can't lose sight of how we begin to implement transport and also the urban outcomes at a place-based level. And there's different motivations and different key directions at every different scale that we need to think at. And we can't have the luxury of thinking at one scale to the detriment of another. We need to make sure that we're driving the agenda at all of these different scales all at once, which can be a bit of a challenge. If we're talking about metropolitan scale thinking, and I think Julian touched on this earlier today when he was talking about the pros and cons for Sydney's Western City idea, it's this kind of metropolitan thinking that begins to lay out a really high-level blueprint for how a city can evolve into the future. And if you're not familiar with it, the basic premise is that you've got Eastern Sydney, which is the global Sydney. It's the piece of Sydney that has the harbour. It's the outward-facing major economic cluster that drives forward the agenda for that place. But if you look at the geographic heart of Sydney, it's actually at Parramatta. And this is the centroid of the centre of gravity of their population as well. So what we're seeing over the last 10 to 15 years is a really significant boost in the level of investment moving into that arena. And I think over time, we'll see that centre of gravity continue to shift west. Now, this scale of thinking is really important for the politicians and how they begin to program their investment in cities. When we start looking at other cities, one of the projects that I've been closely involved in with probably for about 10 years is Gold Coast Light Rail. And one of the critical things there that began to change the local council's thinking about their city was just the unabated sprawl that was occurring. And the light rail project in the case of the Gold Coast, which at that point in time had a population of about 500,000 people, was really about beginning to reprogram the way they thought about how their urban settlement pattern was happening. They're a linear city, so they suit light rail pretty well. And one of the things that begins to influence our thinking, whether we're talking about the Gold Coast, Newcastle, Canberra, or Sydney, is how do we begin to unlock amenity for the future residents of the city? And this goes right to the heart of the notion of livability as a key underlying foundation for economic performance in the cities. And we like to think that there's 7 fundamental bases for that amenity in a city. And when we come up with the urban design frameworks for these places, we want to make sure that we're maximising the number of these amenities that are afforded to each location. And on the Gold Coast, when we did the light rail project, we were trying to think not only in 3 dimensions, but also in 4 dimensions. We were trying to think, well, what does the city look like in 10 years? What does it look like in 30 years? And for me, this scale of thinking, which is about a 12, 13, 14 kilometre long project, is probably the most exciting, and it's the most rich in opportunity to start thinking about how we reprogram the city. How do we start to re-establish the different movement networks? How do we begin to take what was historically a series of quite discrete, I described it as a discrete mosaic of urban communities. On the Gold Coast, it was fragmented by busy roads and the canal network, which incidentally is longer than Venice and Amsterdam combined. And how do we use something like the light rail project to reprogram the city? And that's a common theme in my approach to projects, which is, well, can we take this transport project and use it as a Trojan horse for better urbanism? And the green mesh that you see unlocked by that begins to stitch together the city in totally new ways and connect places that hitherto haven't been connected, and also begin to reprioritise in the yellow lines there the bus networks. When we think about a city at that stage of its planning, we also like to think about how much growth they have and how do they start to apportion that growth. And this is one of the, this is actually the Sunshine Coast, once again, a linear coastal city. And one of the challenges, I think, with most cities when they think in that simplified zoning sense is that they tend to create a homogenous city. And one of the personal motivations for me when we're thinking about a city at this scale is combating the vanilla city. How do we begin to make places which are distinctively different? How do we get an urban form and typology that begins to create villages rather than a characterless sprawl? And the concept, urban growth concept that the Sunshine Coast adopted here was the top one, which was affectionately known as the Tiger Plan to start with, but it was effectively a series of east-west coastal villages, which created the opportunity for you to have a surf in the morning, grab a coffee, then catch the light rail to work. So what we were trying to do was to create a series of discrete villages where you could actually live out your whole life. And the way that the Sunshine Coast is structured is that the urban facilities or community facilities are largely positioned to the west rather than on the coast. So how do we begin to stitch those together to make a series of places people can live in? we also applied that kind of thinking to Canberra. So their light rail project here is under construction at the moment, and the Griffin plan for Canberra was established basically through the competition that was undertaken probably in the order of 150 years ago now. What we were dealing with here was how do we begin to reprogram this city to make more of their major creek networks so that they can become the green lungs of the city. In Canberra's case, the creek network is a trapezoidal drain which separates the city as much as it brings it together. How do we use light rail, which runs down the middle, to create a series of focal points in that city and starts to stitch together the various communities that are presently dislocated by very wide avenues. Brisbane is undertaking its own project at the moment, which I won't talk about in detail. And this brings us to place-based thinking. So that rich level of corridor-wide thinking absolutely is needed to start informing how you begin to weave a transport project through a city and how it can be restructured. But the richest opportunities, again, are actually at the place level. And we've recently brought a group into our practice from London called Free State, and they're experienced master planners, and they've done work with Sony, Virgin Atlantic, a whole bunch of brands, and they're beginning to use brand-orientated thinking in relation to the way they design things. And we find that this is a really important thing for us to bring into our projects, particularly the large-scale projects where people are often making decisions based on quantifiable data and levels of service and everything else. And it's very easy to lose sight of the fact that you've got to put people first with the big projects most of all. So for us, this is a really critical outcome, and particularly with public transport, where all of our cities actually don't, well, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, they have pretty low levels of public transport patronage. So how do we actually begin to attract people back to these systems again and again and again? One of the bigger projects that's underway in Australia at the moment is Melbourne Metro, and we were lucky enough to win this project a year or so ago, and we're in the process of converting what was a bid design into a delivery design. And often a metro project will start with a corridor long section like the one you see on the left-hand side there, and one of the big challenges that you have to deal with when you start working with a project like this is, well, are we going to make a project which has a really strong singular line identity where every single station looks the same? Or do you have a project where every single station starts to manifest in its urban environment in quite a different way and really celebrate the local distinctiveness of each of those places? And I think if I look at this project, it's one of the strengths of it, and also very Melbourne, that it takes that route where each of the stations is really very different and manifests in the city in a totally different way. And there's a beautiful Indigenous narrative which sits over the top of some of these stations as well, which I think is incredibly encouraging to see that kind of narrative emerge into the Australian context at this stage of design. Sydney Metro, which if we think of the idea about a unified project identity versus a bespoke project identity, in this case, this project had a far more unified project expression. And one of the key focal points at this station, which sits in Norwest Business Park, which is one of the largest economic anchors immediately to the northwest, funnily enough, of Sydney, is to create a really strong identity, be positioned on a really important cross street, and making sure that these places are designed for people. And you'll notice that this kind of project, the rail system and its presence in the urban environment is quite discrete from the active areas around it. And this is another critical question around how we begin to structure our transport infrastructure in the city. Because if we look at some of the examples from Asia and China and other places, they have a different approach where the transport infrastructure is completely embedded in the active precincts that are dotted through the city. And I think Japan Rail and also MTR are probably some of the leading examples of how a combined property plus transport model is being executed. And this latest draft of metro projects that we're seeing happening in Australia is trying to balance how we execute these complex major underground projects, but also in a way that works with the property dynamics that we have in each of our cities. And I must say that other than Sydney and Melbourne, the property prices that we see in our Australian cities aren't yet at a tipping point where this kind of development makes a lot of sense. And I think with the Auckland Metro project, this is one of the interesting questions that will need to be dealt with. Shifting scale down to a much smaller city, this is Newcastle. They're in the process of advancing their light rail system, which is actually a much shorter system. And one of the interesting things about this is that Property New South Wales and Urban Growth New South Wales, which is the entity that's given the remit to champion better quality urban outcomes around New South Wales, has actually undertaken a city-wide renewal framework around that major project that we're seeing it remove the heavy rail alignment, which separated Newcastle from its waterfront. We're beginning to see the green shoots of key public corridor connections that stitch the city back together. So I think this is a really good example where we're seeing that public transport infrastructure begin to remove barriers and start to re-stitch back together the city. And going back to Canberra, one of the really interesting things when we transition from that large citywide framework scale and then begin to position ourselves into a street, this layered cross-section speaks to Northbourne Avenue, which some people say is Australia's premier street because it's the north-south axis that both the Hume Highway and other highways channel you down when you're approaching the nation's capital. And so it's one of the really important set-piece approach routes in the master plan for Canberra. And it's been evolving for the last 80 years. There's been various buildings delivered and it's really lacking in character. And there's a very poor a very poor pedestrian environment because it's just so vehicularly dominated at the moment. And one of the key things that we were interested in was beginning to establish a kit of parts that they could start to execute along the avenue. And one of the big ideas that has always existed in Canberra's plan is the notion of coming from bush to capital, because it's envisaged as the bush capital. And I think what we saw here was the opportunity to progressively increase the intensity of development on either side of the avenue and transition from endemic native species through to a mixture of more exotic species as you approach the heart of the capital. One of the really interesting things, and we have this discussion a lot when we're dealing with our transport engineer friends, is that they often conceptualise a transport project as starting at the ticket line and finishing at the other ticket line. And we often have to challenge that idea because it's a holistic door-to-door experience which is so important. And in a pop quiz I did around the office a little while back, around 40% of the public transport journeys of my colleagues were actually undertaken by foot on their approach to stations. And when I analysed a couple of the metro projects we were working on and dodgied up the figures, I basically found out that only 2% of their project budget was allocated towards actual infrastructure that you could see if you weren't catching the train. And so it really began to highlight for me that we need to think about how we better balance our investment in public transport so that we're getting a real community dividend at the surface level, because in most of our cities, more than 85% of the population actually don't use this transport infrastructure. So what is it that we're bequeathing to them that makes it worth their while? And how that begins to play out with the last mile, and I think particularly in relation to the landscape architecture components of these projects, how do we begin to deliver capacity in the public domain, the kind of connections that we need to see to take people to the front door of the station, but also begin to deliver the kind of quality of connections that are needed. And when we're talking about these sort of projects, they're delivering a lot of people into central parts of our cities. And when you start thinking about how you begin to manage those kind of volumes of people as they hit the surface level, you have to start looking at all of the engineering level of service elements that begin to come into play. And so when we start looking at a metro project in a CBD area, for each escalator that we deliver, we need to make sure that there's 2.5 metres of footpath to establish in order to disperse those volumes of people. Otherwise, you begin to sterilise the city into which you're incorporating this sort of infrastructure. Certainly in most places of Australia we have hot summers, and I'm expecting that's the case here. And one of the key things for us is that trees are absolutely fundamental to making sure that people will actually decide not to drive to work, that they'll walk to work instead. And through the research we've done, 26 degrees is the golden number in terms of when people will decide not to walk to public transport. It's when moderate activity begins to make for a very uncomfortable and sweaty commuter. And so we use some of this statistical base to not only talk to the challenges of urban heat island, but also to start talking about how we can begin to extend out to the catchment and begin to green the city from the transport infrastructure out. So this is one of the other key areas that we try and improve the city from public transport as the base. Edges matter. I won't go through this in detail, but it's that bottom piece of all of these buildings that actually defines whether you feel safe in streets, whether you're going to walk to public transport or not. And it's frequently one of the most overlooked elements. And so when we're involved in these projects, we can't just stop at designing proposals for the public domain leading up to the train station. We also need to establish a framework that the planners can begin to execute through new development, so that we're making sure that those new buildings are beginning to engage with the streets, create the kind of places that people want to be in, and start building a more convivial city life. And then one of the other things that's probably not core to the landscape architecture outcomes, but for every major metro project in particular, there's the question of oversight development. And for any architects in the room, there are certain challenges that go with any of these particular projects. And this illustration basically goes right to the heart of one of the challenges that you have to deal with integrating new transport and then deciding how you develop around it. And for us, we usually advocate towards the public realm legacy end of the spectrum, but more and more our government clients are pushing us towards the integrated development end of the spectrum. And it's really just a signal that we need to make sure that we're striking the right balance here. And examples here from Perth, where that's happened historically quite effectively. And the big thing in this case of one of the Perth Central stations, is the integration of a really high quality public domain that not only brings you to the railway station, but also to key activated retail environments as well. Second last slide. It's really important when we look at our cities, and I think most of our cities come most alive when there are major events, particularly major sporting events. And we've just completed the Perth Stadium in the last month or so, and one of the most gratifying things was that they established the railway station at the same time as they established the stadium. And this stadium has absolutely zero car parking, so they're beginning to train people how to move around their city, how the life of the city can begin to exist without needing to drive a car to it. And it's incredibly gratifying to see that open and to start making that sort of change in the way people move around. So just to wrap up, I think for me, the critical takeout is the fundamental focus that we need to have on livability. And it's very difficult to link that back to a transport project, but without efficient transport, which actually creates the kind of city access network that we want to see exist, we don't get the economic performance outcomes that we need, and fundamentally we begin to erode the type of city outcomes we want. So for me, we've got to grasp transit as a catalyst for change and focus on the outcomes listed on the right-hand side of the screen. So I'm out of time there, so thank you very much.
I'm just going to sneak in a question before you sit down. We had 1 minute spare, so it's really interesting to see some really sort of big thinking and integrated projects. And I guess from the outside, it looks a little bit like Australia's better than we are at the sort of value add and the uplift and integrating that into these big projects. Can you perhaps just talk to that for us briefly about what we might learn from some of these Australian projects?
I think, strangely, something that Ryan said struck home with me earlier, is that there's often a whole range of really good ideas that find their way into some of the early planning and the early thinking, and I'm sure it's the same case here. The biggest challenge is how to take those ideas and convert them into political currency, because if you don't take the wider public and the politicians on a journey, then those elements just fall away, and all you get is a fit-for-purpose piece of transport infrastructure. I think for me, we need to challenge the basic models that we're using to assess transport infrastructure, and this is it's actually a legacy of the English decision-making framework that we have to deal with in terms of convincing Treasury about which projects we invest in, and we're constantly struggling against that particular framework to try and get more investment in active travel and other good outcomes. So I think we face exactly the same challenges, and hopefully we'll succeed together. Thank you.